Okay, Stylianos, shall we kick off and we can welcome everybody to today's webinar. Hi everyone, my name's Ben Saunders. I am the co-founder of WeBuild-AI. I'm joined today by Stylianos, who's a colleague of mine from the organization. Stylianos, if you would be kind enough to introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your background, that would be great.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So, hi everyone, I'm Stylianos Economou. I'm a principal AI engineer at WeBuild-AI. My focus is on building production-grade AI systems that connect enterprise knowledge with agents. So, over the past months, I've been leading the development of our MCP integrations, for example, exposing SharePoint as a reusable MCP server and working on the Pathway platform to make these capabilities directly accessible through agents. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Stylianos. And in today's session, we're going to cover everything around agents, MCP, and what we believe to be the future of enterprise knowledge management. So we've got a packed agenda. We've got 45 minutes and very little time to cover what is a very, very complex subject and something that is gathering a lot of traction and commentary across various sectors at this moment in time. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to cover everything from what exactly is model context protocol, what we deem to be a scalable enterprise-ready architecture for deploying these types of capabilities in highly regulated organizations. We'll also then provide a practical example and demonstration of MCP in action, and we'll be using our Pathway platform as part of that demonstration to bring to life what we deem to be the opportunities for organizations of all shapes and sizes and the value that MCP can afford them. And further to that, we're also going to start to look at some practical lessons that myself and Stylianos have garnered from the field and the trips, trials and tribulations that you can avoid as part of your respective adoption journeys. As we start to close out the session as well, we'll bring to life some practical examples and real world case studies of where we're seeing massive wins for our customers when MCP is used correctly and at scale. And then we'll give a practical viewpoint about how you can start your own respective MCP journey and give you a very small glimpse into what we deem to be the future knowledge worker stack of the future. So I guess in terms of you who don't necessarily know us as an organization, we were founded in 2024, but essentially we're a team of AI native solutions builders here at WeBuild-AI. We try not to operate like a legacy consultancy and treat AI as an afterthought. It's built into the very DNA of our business. First and foremost, in terms of how we operate and how we go to market, but fundamentally in terms of how we leverage AI to exponentially accelerate business value outcomes for our respective customers. At the heart of our proposition are a significant number of highly skilled engineers and transformation consultants who are ultimately armed with opinionated technology tooling centered around our Pathway platform in order to deliver end-to-end transformation for enterprise organizations. We really pride ourselves on being able to take organizations from the much vaunted POC purgatory position of yesteryear when it comes to production grade AI. And we've got a significant number of case studies under our belt now where we can provide demonstrable evidence of us being able to 10x value creation for our respective customers. But a little bit less about us and more about the topic that we're here to cover today. I'm sure that many of you have some curiosities about what model context protocol is, how you can use it in your respective lines of business, but ultimately, how do you get started with it and what are the potential road bumps, hiccups, and challenges that you might face along the way. So we'll start to use today's session as a vehicle to really bring those practical experiences to life. And we'll give you a sense as to how we bring MCP to the fore as a conversational tool that unlocks massive value for your respective businesses. So for those of you who probably know a little bit about MCP, this might be telling you how to suck eggs. But think of MCP as a standardized framework that enables us to connect data from various disparate sources and systems together in a unified manner. And ultimately, in doing so, that that enables us to replace somewhat legacy integration protocols, lots of swivel chair activities where we might be gathering data from different knowledge sources, whether that be SharePoint, Jira, GitHub, whether it be our shared drives or Outlook, and ultimately enables us to get access to the information we need most through natural language conversational insights. And if you think about MCP almost as like a translation layer, it's a little bit like an API, but it enables you to convert human language into readable machine interactions where you can extract information from your various knowledge sources across your organization. And I was thinking about a number of metaphors that I could use to bring this to life before today's session. And if you think about yourself working in an international business where everybody speaks different languages, and let's think for a second that those languages are technical languages. So your finance team typically speak in Excel. Your customer relationship management team typically speak in Salesforce type language, and your project management team or your product owners might typically speak in Jira. Ultimately, what you typically need to do is try to understand all of those languages to disseminate the information and consolidate it into a readable format where that could add significant value to you as an individual. But when you start to think about MCP, it's almost like a universal translator. It lets you talk to all of these systems in a common language. So you don't have to do that translation and you don't have to do that data aggregation. So if you were to ask a notional question of what's the status of my biggest client's project, and how much have I invoiced them this month? So I could interact with Jira and understand where that project was in terms of its life cycle. I could then interact with Salesforce and understand what we had billed and what we hadn't billed. And then we could reconcile that against our accounting systems to validate how much more funds we were able to invoice the customer over the lifespan of the project. And being able to disseminate these different languages gives us a much more complete response and really enables us to emphasize the 360 view of our business without having to perform those mundane integrations and interactions across many, many disparate systems to then ultimately synthesize that information down into one common viewpoint. And ultimately, if you think about the protocol as a defined set of agreements, it's a bit like a contract. I will speak to you in this way, and you will help me retrieve this information in a uniformed manner. And it's very much a way in which pretty much any application in your organization over time will be able to follow these rules and these controls and these parameters to essentially join the conversation. And what this will start to enable you to do is bring together many, many disparate data sources, both structured and unstructured data, together in a way where we can ensure that your existing authorization, access control policies, and security guardrails are still adhered to, whilst also unlocking the significant value creation that we've all started to expose in our businesses as a consequence of using agents, large language models, and various other capabilities. So a little bit about what MCP is, but I'm now going to hand over to Stylianos, who's really going to bring to life what this scalable enterprise-ready architecture looks like in earnest. Stylianos, if I could hand over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So let's zoom in one layer deeper and look at what MCP Enterprise, what makes MCP Enterprise ready. So on the left here, we have the MCP server. So a server that can expose multiple connectors, for example, the SharePoint, file systems, or other enterprise data sources. Each connector knows how to deal with its own system complexity, like APIs or file formats, but the server presents them back as a clean, standardized set of tools. So in the middle, we have the client layer. This is really the protocol brain. The client runs inside the host application and takes care of things like handling the MCP protocol and, importantly, authorization. For example, if we need to talk to Microsoft Graph, the client can take care of exchanging the user's token with the authorization token and pass it to the SharePoint connector. That way, the server itself stays stateless and simple, and all authentication logic lives in the client. So on the right, we have the identity and access layer. This is where enterprise controls come in, permission, session management, and policy enforcement, making sure that we don't just plug an AI into data, but that it always respects existing governance and compliance. And at the bottom, you see where this all surfaces in enterprise applications. That could be, as you see here, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, custom AI agent. The important point is that once the server and client layers are in place, the same connector can be reused across all of these applications. So to summarize, the server standardizes access, the client handles the protocol and authentication, and identity makes it enterprise grade. That's what allow us to scale MCP horizontally. And yeah, we don't rebuild the SharePoint logic, for example, in every app. We expose it once, and any host app can securely discover and use it. Yeah, that's it with this side. Yes, if you go to the next one. Yes, before we go into the demo, let me show you how this works in practice. So yeah, on the left, we have the MCP server. This is the piece we built to connect directly into SharePoint in this demo. The nice thing is that the same architecture could just as easily connect to other apps like Jira, GitHub, Notion, or any other enterprise system. On the right, you can see the types of actions, some types of actions that become available once the connection is in place. We can read and analyze documents, report on content, add or delete files, modify and save them, or even move them between folders. So for the demo, we'll focus on SharePoint. I'll show you how the agent can do a couple of these things. And so you will see end to end how the agent can both retrieve and act on live data directly in SharePoint just by talking to it. So yeah, I think we're ready. Yeah, this is Pathway, our multi-model enterprise chat. And I'm chatting with an AI agent that's connected to our SharePoint via MCP. So I will show you tool discovery, browsing the library, creating and deleting a folder, and previewing a document live. So first, let's see what SharePoint tools are available. We can do that by just typing what I said, what tools do you have for interacting with SharePoint, for example. Let's see. Great. You can see tools for listing folders and documents. We have tools for reading content and managing files. So now I will ask for the current contents of the SharePoint library. Again, we can do that with natural language. We can just say, "Can you show me the contents of SharePoint, please?" Oops. Yeah. So as you can see, it lists the top level folders. We have three folders. One of them is a test folder being made specifically for this demo, and we will use it later. Let me switch to the SharePoint tab so you can see the folders there too. So we can see the same three folders the agent returned to confirm that everything works well. But let's create a brand new folder now so you can see the right path working. We can again do that by just speaking with the agent. We can tell it, can you create a, let's name it test2 folder, please. As you can see, it uses a correct tool. The folder should now exist in the library. But let me switch to the SharePoint tab so you can see it for real. Let me refresh first. Yeah, there it is. The test2 created on command just some seconds ago. So back in Pathway, I will clean up by deleting that folder. Again, we can do it just by chatting. We can ask, let's say, the agent to delete the test2 folder. It did it. So back to the SharePoint tab just to confirm that. We need to refresh. And here it is, the agent removed the test2 folder. So we leave things tidy. So now let's drill into our existing test folder to view its files. This is the one I mentioned before. Here it is in the SharePoint tab also. We can just ask the agent again to show us the contents of the test folder so we can see how it looks like. So here are the documents inside. We have one document called test. Let's switch to the SharePoint tab so we can see the document inside the folder. Yeah, you can see it here. Okay, so I will try to open the test document and show just the first page as plain text. So this is where we can act and see things. So we can just say to the agent, can you show me maybe the first page content of the test file, please. Correctly uses the get and parse document tool, and that's the first page, parse to readable text. You see the lorem ipsum is just a nonsensical text we made, and that's it. We just talk to an AI agent, and that is directly connected to SharePoint, discovering tools, browsing, creating, deleting a folder, or even previewing a document. I haven't shown you the document. Let's see the inside of the document to just confirm. As you can see, the first page is exactly what the agent, the lorem ipsum, etc., that the agent gave to us correctly. So it's impressive because all of this happens through simple conversation. There is no switching systems and no manual file navigation. Everything happens with just chatting.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that demonstration, Stylianos. I think you hit the nail on the head there where we talked about being a knowledge worker and working with various digital interfaces can become somewhat fatiguing over time. And I think the one thing I would just wanted to emphasize on is where we've seen value for other customers, where they're very curious about using SharePoint and integrating that into an MCP environment is the first concern often is, well, how do I know what I'm exposing to users? So at the top end of the presentation, you mentioned about inheriting the access control policies and the document access privileges to an object level. So for instance, if you didn't have access to that test file, you wouldn't have been able to retrieve the output in the chat interface. So from a access management perspective, we're not necessarily exposing files to users who should or should not have access to them. So when you think about the challenges with a RAG system where you have to manually map that data access control into the knowledge base as an example, that can be quite an onerous activity. I think one of the other advantageous things that we probably haven't brought to life as part of that demonstration, though, is that when you think about the vast nature of data that sits in SharePoint, many businesses probably haven't classified that data. They probably haven't added sensitivity levels to that data, and they potentially haven't reviewed the access controls of those documents over time. So what we're seeing a significant accelerant for customers who are looking at this is ironically using the MCP capability that Stylianos has just demonstrated in order to add the required tagging, labeling, and metadata management against the document so that we can set sensitivity levels, classification levels of the documents, and actually get our SharePoint instance into a lot more structure and a lot more order ahead of time as well. So we see some massive value as part of this process to bring this to life for customers in a fairly accelerated timeframe. But I think, Stylianos, we had an opportunity to speak about this many months ago, and we've had the fortuitous opportunity to start to build this type of solution for customers of various shapes and sizes. I think it would be great for us to maybe just share some of those experiences that you've been able to harbor through this process. And I think when we spoke probably around about 2 months ago, you were very keen to stress that it's super important to start planning the architecture early and really to treat security as a first-class citizen as part of the design process. So I was just wondering if you could maybe share some of those, maybe those common security oversights that people might necessarily overlook as part of this process, and why it's super important not necessarily to rush that component of any MCP implementation.
Yes, definitely. This is very important remark about the MCP journey. So one of the first lessons we learned is that it's critical to plan your architecture up front. So with MCP, there are, as we saw before, the host and the client. So if you don't decide early where the complexity sits, you run into issues later. So we found it's better to keep MCP servers as thin and stateless as possible and push logic into the client side. Why? Because servers are easier to scale horizontally if they're stateless, and you avoid messy situations where tokens or temporary states get stuck in memory. In our case with SharePoint, if we had stored dedicated tokens in the server process, scaling replicas would have been difficult. So you'd lose tokens when a new instance took over, for example. So by designing the on behalf of token exchange in the client, and letting the server just expose the clean tools, we ended up with a much more scalable and maintainable setup. So the broader takeaway thing is don't just hack something that works. Spend time early deciding what belongs in the server and what belongs in the client side.
Amazing, thank you. And I think one of the earlier slides we showed the visualization of Miro, Notion, SharePoint, Jira, GitHub. It seems that every organization or every SaaS organization on the planet at this moment in time is starting to deploy some form of MCP connection into their systems. But ultimately, MCP is still a relatively young capability. So, what's your advice to organizations around maybe waiting for their SaaS providers to build an MCP, or do they build something custom? What advice would you give to teams when trying to decide whether to build or wait, based on your engineering expertise?
Yes, that's true for the SharePoint also. We spend a lot of time trying to see if there are existing solutions and how good are the ones that exist. So MCP is still very young and not every integration exists yet. That puts teams in a position where they need to decide, do we build something custom now or wait for the ecosystem to catch up? So my approach is to build when the system is core to your business and there is a clear workflow that depends on it. That's why we created our own fast MCP server for SharePoint. We couldn't afford to wait, and by building a minimal set of tools, we unlocked a lot of value immediately. So on the other hand, if an integration is less critical or you suspect it will take a huge effort to cover all the edge cases, then it's usually smarter to wait. So my advice is to wrap your custom work in a stable tool contracts. So when a standardized connector does appear, you can swap it in without rewriting your agents. For example, with SharePoint, we could have built a tool that required Microsoft Graph IDs and site IDs and item IDs, but then if a standardized SharePoint connector comes along, our agents would all break. So instead, we made the tool take a simple site URL, a library name, and file path. That way, the agent always speaks the same language. And if we swap our backend later for an official connector, the agent doesn't need to change at all.
Amazing, amazing. And you mentioned tools a couple of times through that initial passageway. And I think when you did the demonstration, some small cog icons appeared on screen and some green ticks to signify that the tool had been called and successfully executed. I guess the challenge is when you're thinking about building these tools and these capabilities yourselves, that obviously takes careful consideration. But what do you think are some of the warning signs teams should watch out for to indicate that they're potentially trying to do too much too soon, when inheriting these MCP capabilities into their product's lifecycle?
Yeah, I think one of the key lessons we learned is to start small with the tool set. So while it's tempting to expose everything a system can do, it's actually counterproductive. So take Microsoft Graph as an example. It exposes hundreds of endpoints. If we had wrapped all of them into MCP tools, the agent would have been overwhelmed and the risk of misuse would skyrocket. So instead, we learned to curate a small, safe toolset that matches the use case. For SharePoint, our very first step was as simple as it gets, just listing folders and documents that already gave us visibility into the system and unlocked a lot of use cases. Only later, when the workflows demanded it, did we expand into more advanced actions like creating and deleting folders and eventually uploading and updating documents. That gave us a clean, understandable surface for the agent and made its behavior much more predictable. So the lesson here, I think, is MCP gives you the power to expose any system, but that doesn't mean you should expose everything. Start with the tools that solve your business case, validate them, and then add more gradually. So otherwise, you risk complexity and confusion both for the model and for the business user.
Interesting. And I think security obviously comes to play a massive part in that as well, as right when you think about an organization's risk posture and the fear that you potentially expose to various risk and compliance SMEs in the business, where you're giving this notional MCP capability access to do many things. Bringing users and business leaders on that journey over time and slowly but surely introducing these tools and these skills, whilst demonstrating safe, secure practices is a key learning for us as well. I think we've both recognized, though, through this process that we as humans enjoy serendipitous interaction, and we do things ad hoc and we do things on the fly. And I think we've typically found as well that when we're using agents and MCPs, we would typically advocate that we use them for those serendipitous and interactive processes as well. So I'd just be curious, like, what types of tasks are perfect for this kind of ad hoc agent approach versus the slightly more structured workflows that people may or may not have been more familiar with, say maybe from an RPA or robotics process automation era?
Yeah, I think in this era of agentic everything, and it's very controversial now to say that today's agents are not reliable at consistently choosing the right tool at the right time. So if you give them a huge toolbox and expect them to orchestrate workflows perfectly, you'll be disappointed. So for deterministic flows like retrieval augmented generation, or where you always need to fetch from a vector index, for example, you shouldn't even ask an agent to decide. So just wire that flow directly. Where MCP agents, though, shine is an ad hoc interactive tasks. For example, an investor might say list the latest board packs, then open the cover page, then create a folder for Q3 answers, and finally move this file into that folder. So those are branching interactive steps that fit perfectly with an agent connected through MCP. So those aren't predefined workflows, they're situational requests. And in those cases, MCP tools give the agent just enough power to act directly on live systems without having to pre-build a pipeline. So the lesson, I think, is don't overhype agent autonomy. Use them where flexibility is needed. You can use them also in a hybrid way with RAG, for example, but you need to keep them apart. So you keep fixed workflows deterministic outside the agent and use the agent where flexibility is needed with the MCP, for example.
Amazing, awesome. And I think as part of the kind of coverage that we've touched on so far, you've mentioned fast MCP and workflows and everything in between through the conversation today. And as we all know, any good architecture needs to be composable. You need to be able to swap things in and out. And I think that this is particularly important for regulated businesses who potentially don't want to have a dependency on a single framework, a single model, a single agentic capability, whatever that may well be over time. I guess the thing I wanted to pose to you here is, for teams that are just getting started with MCP, how do you recommend they think about modularity from day one? And I guess what's the biggest modularity mistake that you've seen, or you probably made yourself, that may have created you some headaches further down the road when using MCP in the wild?
Yeah, that's a good question. We learned that infrastructure makes all the difference. So MCP by itself is just a protocol. You need the right tooling around it to make it usable in practice. So on the server side, we built fast MCP to expose SharePoint actions as tools quickly and reliably. On the client side, we used AutoGen to automatically discover and register those tools for the agent. So that meant the moment we added a new tool on the server, it was instantly available to the agent without extra coding. So without that, every new tool would have been a heavy lift and experimentation would have slowed down. So the biggest modularity mistake I've seen is teams skipping that approach and either cramming everything into one giant do-it-all tool or wiring tools manually into every agent. So both make the system rigid. You can't test properly, you can't assign permissions, as we said before, cleanly, and every change becomes really painful. So the better pattern is to keep tools small and composable and let infrastructure like AutoGen handle the discovery. And that's what makes MCP scalable, I think, and practical for a business rather than just a neat demo.
Perfect. Awesome. And I guess as well, right, once you've built these tools and these integrations, and maybe once you've built one or two of them, they become extendable into other capabilities or other products across the business. So if you can kind of blueprint or templatize what these tools or actions look like, you can start to make these reusable, extendable, and share them with other members of your team across the business, so that you don't create this this almost kind of single person or single factory dependency on a single team to build those capabilities. Thank you so much for taking us through that. I think that was really valuable in terms of the lessons learned from some real world deployments of MCP into production. As I mentioned, Stylianos has kind of alluded to some of those practical experiences that we've seen on the front line, so to speak. And we've already explained some of the examples where MCP are being applied across a whole litany of SaaS software solutions. In today's demonstration, Stylianos has demonstrated how we're using MCP to be integrated into knowledge bases, more specifically into SharePoint. And we're seeing significant value for some of our customers in the private equity space, as an example, where they are now starting to expose historical legal papers, contracts, shareholders agreements, SPA documents, whatever it may well be, and essentially using those MCP connectors into knowledge bases to support with rapid responses to investors as part of fundraising activities. We're also seeing MCP used to a greater extent in terms of creating preliminary or final investment reports, as an example, or even supporting with MCP connections into reputable and trusted third-party data sources like Moody's and Bloomberg, essentially taking the investment research process from days down into a matter of minutes. So one of our customers now can research potential portfolio companies in just under a minute using the capabilities that Stylianos has brought to life today. And when you think about the knowledge worker, that's one angle where you can see significant value of being able to synthesize and retrieve information from multiple data sources across the business. But we're also seeing significant value using MCPs in the software delivery cycle, as an example. So we've mentioned how MCPs can plug into GitHub, how it can plug into Jira, how you might want to plug it into Trello or Notion, whatever it may well be from your workflow management perspective. But when you think about what we do in the enterprise, when we build digital products and digital software solutions, we often have to align to security standards. We often have to align to enterprise architecture blueprints. And many of those things typically sit in standard documents that outline the acceptable patterns and blueprints that organizations should adhere to. So we've been working with one specific customer to look at how We can reimagine their software delivery lifecycle, first and foremost using generative AI to build a new deal pipeline and deal management solution, but actually then starting to think about how we can use MCPs into language models so that agents can help us create design documentation on the fly, as an example, all grounded into the context of the application or the infrastructure code that we're writing at the time. How we can then push those MCP integrations into knowledge bases to ensure that the documentation that we create in order to go into design and review boards is of a sufficient tone of voice, of a sufficient caliber, and is structured in a way that we can adhere to the control policies of an organization. So ultimately, there's a significant number of disparate ways in which MCP can be applied in any business today, but we're seeing significant value for a number of organizations to really accelerate and emphasize the discovery and accessibility of data for knowledge workers, and also see some massive levers for engineers, platform, software engineers, etc., who work in that product delivery lifecycle as well. When you start to think about the things that Stylianos has alluded to as part of the conceptual architecture and that initial segue that I provided at the top end of the presentation, and the demo that Stylianos provided in terms of that user interface from our Pathway Launchpad, what does this really look like when you start to think about the MC-powered knowledge stack of the future? And I'm sure many of you have used ChatGPT, or you've used Claude or some other form of popular language model SaaS-based experience, and you've walked away from it pretty compelled and pretty excited about the value that it can deliver to you on a day-by-day basis. But where we think the world is moving to is essentially into this unified knowledge management stack, where you will have an AI chat interface, a data visualization capability, a modeling canvas, which of sorts is your scratch pad, where you can rapidly put some notes, some thoughts, or some sketches down in terms of your thought process for a particular problem statement, and then kind of interfacing into traditional document management style solutions, whether that be Word, PowerPoint, Google Slides, Google Sheets, Excel. We kind of see that whole thing coming together in a unified interface. And that can only really be achieved through a number of underlying capabilities that sit under the hood. Invariably, we've spoken significantly about MCP over the course of today's session, but at the heart of all of that, you still need to have some form of agentic framework. You still need to be really, really diligent about how you manage context through those business processes. And as Stylianos has alluded throughout the course of today's presentation, you need to be able to build, design, operate, and govern a significant number of tools that enable you to read, access, write, review, analyze, add, delete, and do other sorts of things that we would typically take for granted as a traditional knowledge worker. But underneath that, we need to ensure that we can orchestrate, we can monitor, and we can observe those interactions that are happening on a millisecond by millisecond basis. Because when we start to get into the realm of exposing information and exposing data into this kind of MCP world, it becomes intrinsically important to be able to understand what's happening, why it's happening, when it's happening, and how. And having that orchestration capability plugged into your frameworks then enables you to maximize the use of agents and MCP at large. And it's when you start to get much, much further down the stack, you start to see we have agents that can take on specific personalities. These agents can have access to tools which ultimately integrate with MCP. And these tools could be much more diverse than what Stylianos and I were talking about momentarily. We could give them access to execute code. We could give them access to integrate with APIs. We could give them access to analyze and synthesize significant data sets. And ultimately, when you start to build this interconnected ecosystem, that's where you need a diverse set of language models, or finely tuned small language models to a certain extent, that can help you execute those processes end to end. And invariably, vectorization and RAG will still play some form of part in your overarching architecture, but it's how you then bring those structured and unstructured data sources together with the language models, but ultimately harmonize that through some form of knowledge graph suite of capabilities where you can then start to synthesize that information across various disparate data sources and knowledge bases and systems of record across your business. So that ultimate accountability of structured and unstructured data and having the requisite data governance practices becomes intrinsically important to everything that you want to do in terms of unlocking the business value that we've alluded to over the course of today's conversation. We've covered a lot of ground in a very, very short space of time. We've got about 4 minutes left, and we wanted to enable some time for questions from the audience. We did actually have some questions come in ahead of the session. So I'm going to just pick out one or two of those now so that we can pose them. So the first question I've got is from Sarah, and Sarah's asked us, OpenAI has just launched the developer mode for ChatGPT with full MCP support. Yes, they have, but many commentators are calling it powerful but dangerous. From your engineering perspective, what specific security risks should enterprises be most concerned about when implementing MCP connections, and how can they mitigate these dangers while still gaining the benefits? That was a long question. We'll try and decompose that as best as we possibly can. And it's a real zinger for us to get started on. I think first and foremost, whenever OpenAI release anything these days, it becomes a mixture of fanfare and fear from commentators across the industry. But what I would say is that with that ability to directly read and write into ChatGPT and through ChatGPT, that does come with significant risks. And there have been some examples of late where some commentators have demonstrated how a calendar invite in Outlook can be hijacked through some form of malicious prompting activity, where Outlook can then be hijacked through some form of language model and/or agentic experience. I think that's very, very difficult to control against. But what I would say is that it's great and it's very, very encouraging that people are exposing and identifying these risks in an accelerated way, coming back to Stylianos' point of the community earlier on in the conversation. But from an engineering standpoint, I think enterprises need robust authentication, which is what Stylianos alluded to. You need to be able to carefully inspect payloads and information that flows in and out of these MCP connectors, which is why orchestration becomes super, super important. But ultimately, you need to treat MCPs with the same security controls and rigor that you would do with any enterprise system and/or API integration. So just because you are able to flow information through the business freely doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat it with a high degree of caution and wariness. So testing is super important, both from a user acceptance testing perspective, but also from a security and compliance perspective. So red teaming these types of connections even before they go into the wild is super, super, super important from my standpoint. We've got time for one other question. Stylianos, I'm going to hand this one over to you. In a recent blog, you mentioned that Fast MCP makes tools easy for AutoGen with auto discovery. I think that's a bit of a repeat on the modularity question that we've had come through. So I'm not going to repeat that one. So we'll leave that one be. Stylianos, I guess before we close out, are there any final thoughts or considerations that you might want to share with the audience before we close out in earnest?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we discussed about the 5 lessons learned. So across these 5 lessons, like the architecture, the custom work, the tool curation, etc., the pattern is clear. MCP is powerful, but it's not magic. So to use it in enterprise settings, you need thoughtful design, some engineering investment and discipline in how you expose the tools. So if you do that, you get the best of both worlds. So secure, scalable access to enterprise systems and flexible agents that can actually help business users.
Perfect. Thank you for that final thought, Stylianos. For